There are stories that start so ordinarily that we could never imagine the dark turn they would take. This is one of them. Today, I want to take you to the darkest heart of the forest, that place where darkness rules everything, where no one can reach or hear us. Be careful the next time you decide to venture into a forest or go camping. The story you're about to hear comes from someone who never imagined they would become the protagonist of a real nightmare. Good evening, Dom. I decided to share this story because it has never left my mind. What we experienced that night changed the way I see the world and the limits of what is possible. I was like many others, a skeptic of anything supernatural. Even after hearing stories from trustworthy people and witnessing a few inexplicable situations, I never seriously considered that such things could be real. But life has a way of shaking our certainties. The day came when I became that person. Someone who shares their experience while facing the skeptical gazes of those who would only believe if they saw it with their own eyes. If you want to know, though I wish you'd trust my words, I wouldn't want anyone to go through what I did. Not even those who called me crazy, both me and the others who witnessed what I'm about to recount. It all happened just a few kilometers outside Mexico City at a popular camping destination. I don't want to name the place. Curiosity might draw unprepared people to dangers they shouldn't face. My story begins on a camping trip I reluctantly joined at the last minute. It was a gathering with my girlfriend Bettina's friends. She loved going on these adventures with Paula and Beatrice, often accompanied by Christian, Paula's boyfriend, and Pedro, who had been in an on and off relationship with Beatrice since I met them. Even during the roughest patches of their relationship, Pedro and Beatrice shared a passion for camping. However, on this occasion, a particularly serious fight caused Pedro to back out. With everything already planned, Bettina called me asking me to join her. She knew how much I hated camping. I can't stand the discomfort of being away from a decent bed just to enjoy nature. Still, she insisted. She said she had a bad feeling and needed me to come. Not because I was another guy in the group, but because she trusted me to look after her. I couldn't say no. I let my family know, wrapped up a few work tasks, and rushed to Paula's house, the meeting point. From the start, I felt something strange. I thought it was the tension from Beatrice and Pedro's argument, but it soon became clear there was more to it. It was as if an invisible tension lingered in the air, hard to ignore and impossible to explain. Despite the unease surrounding us, no one considered canceling the trip. After all, who really does that? Everyone was convinced that once we reached the forest, the fresh air, towering trees, and distance from urban life would ease any discomfort. During the drive, we gradually shed our fears, laughing and joking along the way. By the time we parked the truck and set out along the trail to find a camping spot, the mood had lightened considerably. Perhaps that momentary light-heartedness led us to make decisions I deeply regret today. The usual spot they used was taken. We moved on and found other groups, but one in particular seemed to be there just to drink and make noise. I remember Paula or Beatrice mentioning that if we stayed near them, it would only be a matter of time before we got annoyed or ended up in trouble. That's when Christian suggested a more secluded spot he'd been to before. It was much deeper into the forest, several kilometers away. He knew the area well and assured us it would be worth it. He said the journey was long but full of beautiful sights to pause and enjoy, and that no one usually ventured there, especially not the kind of campers looking for a drunken party. Exhausting, yes, but he promised it would be rewarding. Still buoyed by good spirits and wanting to avoid trouble with the other groups, we agreed. Today, I bitterly regret that choice. The hike was long. Gradually, exhaustion began to take its toll, and the joking became scarce. After hours of walking, our energy was nearly drained. That's when something unexpected happened. We saw movement among the trees. We stopped, surprised and a little frightened. Suddenly we noticed several people in the vegetation, first 2, then 5, 8, until there seemed to be nearly 20 of them. They also appeared just as surprised as we were. I went straight to Christian, asking where he had taken us, whether we were on private property or if there was any danger. He assured me he'd never seen anything like this before and tried to calm me down, saying they probably weren't dangerous. He pointed to an older man in the group, a priest with a serene demeanor, dressed in black with a clerical collar. We tried to greet them, but they didn't respond. We just kept moving. trying to distance ourselves. Soon we realized 2 boys around 12 or 13 years old had started following us at a distance. Though they tried to be discreet, their steps were easy to hear in the oppressive silence of the place. Every sound they made off the trail seemed amplified. Finally, we reached the spot Christian had promised, and he was right. The place was stunning. Surrounded by tall pine trees, it felt like stepping into a medieval setting, the kind you only see in movies or books. The proximity of something so magical to the city unsettles me to this day, especially on sleepless nights. After setting up camp, we prepared something to eat, famished and exhausted. We talked, laughed, and relaxed, but soon noticed something odd. The only sound we could hear was our own voices. The wind, which had been blowing gently before, had stopped. There was no sign of birds, insects, or any other natural sounds. A chilling, absolute silence enveloped the area. As night fell, I felt an immense fatigue, despite it still being early. Sitting with Bettina and Beatrice, we chatted absent-mindedly while Paula and Christian went off to explore further. That's when we heard a strange sound, a distant screech, almost like a hum traveling through the treetops. Shortly after, we heard murmured prayers and the sound of footsteps running among the pines, quickly approaching. We stood up in an instant, hearts racing, eyes scanning the vegetation around us, bracing for something or someone to confront us. We thought about moving further up the slope, both to distance ourselves from the campfire's glow and to get a better view of our surroundings. Before we could decide, a loud crash broke the silence, coming from somewhere in the darkness, not far from where we were. From the opposite direction came rapid footsteps, but soon we saw it was Paula and Christian running scared. They'd heard everything too, but hadn't seen anyone. They only described the feeling of people running beside them in the pitch-black darkness. The overwhelming sensation that we weren't alone was suffocating. We had to decide, would we hike back to the car, even if it meant hours of walking in the dark, or stay and face the night, surrounded by this mystery? We heard another noise from the forest, something heavy that seemed to be dragging itself. Someone suggested it might be an animal. Mustering the little courage we had left, we decided to split up to investigate. Christian went alone while Paula and Beatrice took a flashlight and went together in one direction. I went with Bettina in the other. We ventured just far enough to cover more ground, keeping the flashlight beams visible to each other. Shortly after, a distant sound came from the direction Christian had gone. His flashlight beam was fixed on something we couldn't see. Paula and Beatrice shouted, asking if he was okay, but there was no response. The light remained still, as if he were frozen. We decided to get closer. When we reached them, Paula and Beatrice were standing a few meters away from Christian, too scared to move forward. I asked Bettina to stay with them and continued alone. Each step toward Christian felt like an eternity. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. As I got closer, I finally saw what he was illuminating. In front of him was a figure straight out of a nightmare. A woman with elongated arms twisted like branches. Her body was half human, half tree trunk. She wore something resembling a cloak or tattered black dress, like old leather. Her hair was matted, falling like a wild mass. She dragged herself slowly as if injured, avoiding the light but unable to flee. Christian stood frozen, barely breathing. Using my flashlight, I shone more light on her. When the beam reached her face, she turned her head. Her teeth were sharp like an animal's, and her skin looked covered in bark and moss. I felt a strong grip on my arm and almost screamed, but it was Christian, who had snapped out of his trance. He leaned in and whispered in my ear, "She's a witch, they threw her down here." Those words sent a chill through me. I had never seen anything so disturbing. He tugged on me, trying to pull us away, but at that moment the screech we had heard earlier echoed through the trees again. Only this time it seemed to come from all directions at once, amplified by countless voices. They're coming for her," Christian muttered desperately. Without further explanation, he pulled us along and we began to run. The 5 of us dashed blindly along the trail as the sound grew closer and closer. We tried stopping a few times to make sense of what was happening, but Christian was firm. "If they catch us, we'll never leave here." And so we ran, never looking back, terror consuming us with every step. Christian kept repeating that it was a matter of life or death, that we couldn't stop for anything. If anyone fell behind, they would be left behind, because he wouldn't wait. Bettina and Beatrice occasionally slowed down and I stayed behind them, urging and pushing them forward. Christian and Paula were ahead, making the path. We were descending a slope, and gravity was doing the work. We could barely control our steps, just letting our legs move while the screeches echoed throughout the forest. It was then that I noticed something strange. Among the branches, I saw figures running in the same direction as us. At first, I thought it was Christian with Paula, but soon I realized it was the boys who had followed us earlier. Further ahead, more silhouettes began to emerge. I recognized people from the group we had seen hours ago. They were running with the same urgency, as if fleeing something they had caused. Finally, we reached a flatter part of the trail, indicating we were near where we'd left the truck. The stretch we had descended in 1 hour had taken several to climb, but something was wrong. The place looked the same, but our truck wasn't there, not even the other 2 vehicles we had seen when we arrived. It was as if everyone had vanished. For a moment, I thought Christian and Paula might have abandoned us. He left us, I thought, struggling to contain my frustration. Suddenly, an elderly woman appeared, walking up the trail and waving at us. She said, "This way, this way." With no other option, we followed her at a distance, hoping she could lead us to a safe place to hide. She guided us off the main path, but soon something strange began to happen. Distant screams started to rise, muffled, as if coming from underwater. They sounded like Christian and Paula's voices, calling out for us, echoing from far away. Suddenly, we felt firm hands grabbing us, stopping us in our tracks. When we turned, it was them. They had appeared out of nowhere, desperate, trying to pull us back. "What are you doing?" they asked, panting. We told them we were following the old woman. Christian and Paula looked behind us, confused. There was no one there, only a steep cliff and impenetrable darkness. We had been walking straight toward it. Back on the main trail, we followed Christian and Paula to where the truck should have been. This time, it was finally there. We got in, locked the doors, and tried to process what had just happened. I asked why we weren't leaving immediately, but Paula explained that the gas tank had been siphoned. We could try pushing the truck downhill, but we wouldn't get far. We found a roll of duct tape inside the vehicle and used it to cover the windows with clothing, trying to block any view into or out of the truck. We wanted to isolate ourselves completely from whatever was outside. During the night, we heard voices again and saw, through small gaps we left uncovered, figures running by. Some of them looked like the people we had seen earlier, but we tried to ignore them. Eventually, we managed to get a few hours of restless sleep. When the sun rose, it felt like the worst had passed. We decided to split up. Christian and I would return to the trail to retrieve our belongings, while the girls went to find gasoline. The daylight brought a false sense of safety, but nothing could erase what we had experienced that night. About half an hour into the trail, we came across some men from the group we had seen the previous day. They were calling out a name, shouting into the forest as if searching for someone. This time, we approached them to understand. They said they were looking for the priest who had disappeared during the night. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed him whole. We told them we were heading back to our campsite and would let them know if we found him. Then they asked if we had camped in a specific spot, describing our location precisely. We confirmed, and they warned us. There was nothing left of our campsite. They said it looked as though an absurd number of animals had destroyed it during the night. They also added that if anything was left, it now belonged to the forest, and we shouldn't try to take it back. We took their advice and returned to the truck. There we found a family with the girls, a woman, presumably the mother, and 2 sons. They were helping them and were shocked to hear that we had spent the night there. They had brought enough gasoline to get us out of the area. Before we left, they gave us a stern warning, never to return to that region at night, especially so far from the usual camping spots. They explained that while strange events didn't always happen, there were times when the mountains revealed what they hid. What they said next still gives me chills. They claimed that even when you don't see them, there are things always nearby, circling, smelling you in the darkness. They feed on you in ways no one can explain, silently. We left that place, but the rest of the day felt surreal, as though nothing had happened. We tried to act normal, pretending we weren't carrying it with us. However, the next morning, the impact hit us like a crushing wave. The fear we had repressed overwhelmed us. We were truly shaken. And now I know that fear in its purest form, is enough to make a person physically ill. Not a day goes by that I don't remember that creature crawling, that thing that barely resembled a human. On rainy nights, I still seem to hear its wailing drawing closer. I try to tell myself it's just the trauma, but something deep inside tells me this will stay with me forever. I just hope it remains only a ghost of memory and nothing more. Before we move on to the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to get the latest stories. Your presence means a lot, and your support is essential. All right, let's keep going. My name is Jose. I'm 76 years old, and even though I never imagined I would need to share this story, I feel that the time has come. Perhaps it won't be easy to hear, just as it isn't simple for me to tell. It's about how I lost everything: my family, my home, and above all, my peace. Maybe by narrating this I can warn someone, or perhaps it's merely a record of something no one should ever go through. I was born and raised in Guadalajara, in a humble neighborhood where life was always challenging. From an early age, I learned that to move forward, I had to work harder than everyone else. And so I did. I started working as a helper in a small shop, carrying boxes and organizing products. Over time, I saved enough money to open my own business. Gradually, my hard work paid off, and I eventually became the owner of several businesses throughout the city. Looking back, I'm amazed at how much I accomplished, but none of these achievements would mean anything without Isadora. Isadora. She was my partner, my strength, the reason why everything was worth it. We met at a neighborhood fair. Clumsy as always, I hesitated to ask her to dance, but she just smiled and took the initiative. From that moment, we were inseparable. She was a strong-willed woman, someone who knew how to keep everyone close and united. We got married while we were still young, full of hopes and dreams. We had 3 children: Mateus, Carolina, and Bruno, our greatest pride and reason for living. Our home was always filled with laughter. Isadora was famous among the neighbors for the mole she made, and her afternoons in the kitchen were accompanied by boleros while the children played in the backyard. Even though I worked a lot, I always reserved weekends for family outings at the park. Isadora would greet me at home with a look that said, "As long as we're together, everything will be okay." When our businesses prospered, we managed to buy a bigger house, simple but perfect for us. The backyard had lemon trees, and on the porch, Isadora loved having coffee while watching the sunset. It was there we celebrated birthdays, school achievements, and faced life's challenges. Being together made everything more bearable. But life, so unpredictable, can also be cruel. 5 years ago, I lost Isadora, and everything fell apart. It was an ordinary day, like any other. She was in the kitchen, preparing lunch, when she suddenly collapsed. The doctors diagnosed a cerebral aneurysm, something quick and painless. Those words, however, brought no relief. They never would. When I returned home, that place that had always been full of life and warmth felt deserted. In the kitchen, the pot of broth she had been preparing was still there, as if at any moment she would walk in to tell me it was ready. But that never happened. I tried to move on, especially for my children, but it was an enormous effort. Matthias, the eldest, buried himself in work and rarely came around. Carolina, always sensitive, tried to be strong, but I often saw her crying alone in the backyard. Bruno, the youngest, seemed completely lost, unable to cope with it all. I wanted to be the pillar of the family, but my own pain consumed me. The house ceased to be a home and became a constant reminder of what we had lost. Months passed, but the emptiness remained unbearable. My children, each dealing with grief in their own way, began to drift apart. And then the unimaginable happened. Isadora's absence not only left an emotional void, but also unraveled the bonds that held us together as a family. It all started during a lunch I insisted on organizing. The conversation seemed casual until Mateus brought up something unexpected. "Dad, I think we should start organizing the family properties to avoid problems in the future." I was speechless. Organize? What problems? I was the owner of the properties, and it made no sense to bring this up now. Before I could react, Carolina tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, but Bruno, as if agreeing with Matthias, added, "He's right, Dad, better safe than sorry." That left a bitter taste in my mouth. Since when did the children Isadora and I had raised so carefully begin to see me as a burden or an obstacle? Something felt off, but I couldn't quite grasp what. In the days that followed, the topic of the properties started to dominate our conversations, and the arguments became increasingly frequent. They insisted on the need to put everything in order. I tried to ignore them, believing it was just a phase, but I was wrong. The relationship with them became more strained. Matthias, always direct, talked about contracts and documents. Carolina tried to ease the tension, but it was clear the subject bothered her. Bruno, quieter, clearly sided with his siblings. There came a point when I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront them. I said very clearly that the properties were mine, the result of a lifetime of work, and that as long as I was alive, no one would make any decisions on my behalf. I thought that would settle the matter, but it only sparked something even bigger, something I couldn't have foreseen. After that confrontation, I assumed we had resolved the issue. But in the following weeks, I noticed their visits became rarer. When they did come, the atmosphere was heavy, filled with an unspoken discomfort. At first, I tried to ignore it, but as time passed, it became impossible. Until one day, Matthias showed up at my house with a folder full of documents. He looked at me with his usual seriousness and said, "Dad, we need to talk. I brought the papers to organize the properties." That phrase filled me with a rage I could barely contain. Papers. Organize. What did that mean? I held back as much as I could and replied that there was no need, that everything was already in order. But he insisted, "It's for your safety, Dad. We want to make sure everything is clear." The concern he displayed felt superficial, almost rehearsed. I couldn't help but think there was something behind all this. The boy who used to run around the yard laughing now seemed like a stranger. The argument was inevitable, and Matthias left angry, leaving the documents on the table. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at that folder on the table, feeling that something dark was unfolding. In the following days, things only got worse. Bruno and Carolina started backing Matthias, insisting it was the best course of action to avoid future problems. But in practice, all they managed to do was deepen the tensions. The conversations, which should have been about reconciliation, ended in fights. Then, on an especially difficult day, Carolina said something that sent chills down my spine. "Dad, we're just thinking about what's best for you. We don't want anything to happen and leave things unresolved." That phrase echoed in my mind. What were my children planning? What did they mean by unresolved? My doubts grew, and the feeling of betrayal suffocated me. It was hard to accept that those Isadora and I had devoted everything to now seemed to be acting against me. I wondered if there was anything I could do to prevent the conflict that seemed inevitable. Weeks later, I received a letter that would change my life forever. It was an official notice informing me that I would undergo a medical evaluation to determine my capacity to manage my assets. I was in shock. My own children had started this process. A bitter mix of anger and sadness took over me. When I confronted Matthias, he responded calmly, but his words felt like a blow. "Dad, it's for your own good. We want to protect you." The word protect sounded like poison. Protect me from what or whom? From themselves? After that, everything happened quickly. A doctor came to my house. He was a distant man who barely looked me in the eye while asking banal questions about my routine. I knew this was just a formality, a sham to validate what they had already decided. Days later, another letter arrived, a court decision declaring me incapable of managing my own assets. It was as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. All the hard work of a lifetime was now in the hands of my children. But the greatest pain wasn't losing the properties, it was facing the betrayal. Knowing that those I loved most had conspired against me. The lawyer who brought the notice tried to soften the situation, saying it was for the best. But I knew the truth. I had lost not only my assets, but also my dignity. The worst was yet to come. Under the pretext of taking care of me, my children decided to put me in a nursing home. The place was gloomy, empty, where time seemed to drag. My room was small, containing only a bed and a table. Through the window I could see a desolate courtyard with a single bougainvillea, as forgotten as I was. Mateus, Carolina, and Bruno didn't visit anymore. They had gotten what they wanted. I was out of the way. The silence in that place was suffocating. I spent my days sitting by the window, reliving memories of happier times with Isadora and my children. However, these memories were more painful than comforting. Until one day, while watching the dry leaves fall from the bougainvillea, someone appeared to break the cycle of solitude. Guilherme, a young staff member at the nursing home. Guilherme had something different about him. His calm demeanor and honest smile set him apart from the others. Slowly, he began to sit with me, simply to listen. He was the first person in a long time who seemed genuinely interested in me. After weeks of conversation, I felt I could trust him, and one afternoon, I told him my story. I spoke of Isadora, my children, and how they had taken everything from me. Guilherme listened attentively, nodding now and then. When I finished, he surprised me by saying, "My grandmother can help you." I looked at him confused. Without haste, Guilherme explained that his grandmother, Donna Simone, was known for practicing unusual things. Magic, more specifically, black magic. At first, the idea seemed absurd to me, but in the midst of my desperation, I began to consider it. He sensed my hesitation and added, "You don't need to believe, Mr. Jose, you just need to be willing to try." That night, Guilherme's words wouldn't leave my head. My desperation, combined with the desire to reclaim everything I had lost, began to weigh more than any skepticism. A few days later, without thinking too much, I called Guilherme to my room and told him I was willing to speak with his grandmother. I still made it clear that I didn't believe in any of it. He simply smiled and replied, "You don't need to believe, Mr. Jose, you just need to want back what is yours." That same afternoon, Guilherme arranged the meeting. We went to a small house on the outskirts of town. It was an old building, surrounded by dry trees, and the atmosphere seemed heavy, as if the very air had weight. As we crossed the door, I felt something strange, a dense atmosphere I couldn't explain. Donna Simone, a lady with deep eyes and a firm voice, welcomed us as though she already knew exactly why we were there. Without me saying a word, she declared, "It is the anger in your heart that brought you here." She explained that the work she would do required seriousness, as it involved forces that demanded a price. She said she would need something personal, an object that symbolized my connection to those who had wronged me. Without thinking too much, I handed her an old photo of my family, taken in happier times, when Isadora and I were standing alongside Mateus, Carolina, and Bruno. With the photo in hand, Donna Simone began preparing what she called a ritual of justice. On the floor, she drew a circle with black salt, surrounding it with candles. In the center, she placed the photo and a small notebook she handed me, instructing, "Write the names of those who have hurt you, but do it without hesitation. You must be convinced." My hand trembled as I wrote. When I finished, the names of Mateus, Carolina, and Bruno were there. I handed the notebook to her, and she analyzed it in silence before placing it in the center of the circle. Then she lit the candles and began chanting in a strange, almost guttural language. The air seemed to shift as she spoke. A cold wind rose, despite all the windows being closed, and the flames of the candles flickered as if alive, following the rhythm of Donna Simone's words. A shiver ran down my spine, and I couldn't tell if it was my imagination or something real. After a while, she stopped chanting and looked at me intently. "They have agreed. I didn't ask who they were. Deep down, I knew I didn't want to know. What I wanted was for it to work, for my life to return to what it had been before." That night, I returned to the nursing home with mixed feelings: hope, fear, and an unsettling sense of change. In the days that followed, unexpected things began to happen. It all started with a call from a lawyer recommended by Guilherme, a man named Benedito Cervantes. He said he had reviewed my case and found serious irregularities in the interdiction process. According to him, my children had forged documents and manipulated the system to take control of my assets. I could hardly believe it. For months I had accepted my situation as final, without any way out. Now, for the first time, there was a chance to get back what was mine. Benedito explained that there was room to start a process to reverse the interdiction and recover what was rightfully mine. When I told Guilherme, he smiled calmly and said, "I told you my grandmother knew what she was doing. The legal process was exhausting. Benedito, an experienced lawyer, handled everything with precision. During the first hearings, he presented solid evidence that the medical documents used against me had been falsified. Matthias tried to justify his actions, saying he did everything for my safety. But Benedito was direct. Safety is no excuse for manipulation and fraud. My children were visibly uncomfortable. Carolina avoided any eye contact and seemed to want to disappear. Bruno could barely look at me. Matthias, always proud, tried to maintain composure, but his nervousness was evident. Each hearing felt like a battle, but with each passing day I felt closer to recovering my life. However, something deeply disturbed me. As the case progressed, I began to remember the words of Donna Simone about the price I would have to pay. One night I received a call from Benedito. His voice was more serious than ever when he announced, "Mr. Jose, something has happened to Bruno. He was in a car accident. Unfortunately, he didn't survive. It felt like the ground had disappeared beneath me. I couldn't breathe. My heart felt crushed by the pain. I couldn't shake the thought that this might be connected to the ritual. Was Bruno the price that Donna Simone had mentioned? Had I sacrificed my son in exchange for what they had taken from me? That thought began to gnaw at me. Despite the mourning, Benedito insisted that we not abandon the case, arguing that we were close to winning. A few weeks later, the judge annulled the interdiction, restoring my control over the properties and the independence that had been ripped away from me. But there was no taste of victory. The emptiness left by Bruno overshadowed everything. Returning home was a mix of triumph and desolation. I had regained what was mine, but nothing seemed the same. The house, once filled with life, now felt empty and cold. There were no more laughs, no music, no Isadora cooking to the sound of the radio. Only echoes of what once was. On the first night back, I sat on the porch where Isadora used to have her coffee at dusk. I looked at the backyard, seeking comfort in the trees she loved so much. But the crushing silence was the only answer. I closed my eyes, and for a brief moment I almost heard her voice calling me. When I opened my eyes, the emptiness surrounded me once again. The days that followed were distant. After the trial, Matthias and Carolina made no effort to contact me, and I didn't reach out to them either. Something had broken between us, something that seemed impossible to fix. I wondered if they also missed what once united us, but there was never an answer. Bruno's death was a weight I couldn't ignore. No matter how much I tried to accept that it was an accident, the doubt persisted. The pact with Donna Simone never left my mind. Had it been just a coincidence, or was it truly the price I paid? This uncertainty became a burden, something I carried with me at every moment. One day, while going through the papers Benedito had returned to me, I came across the photo I had given to Donna Simone during the ritual. Something about that image disturbed me deeply. The faces of my children and Isadora seemed changed, as if time or some other mysterious force had altered the photograph. I stared at it for several minutes, trying to decipher what caused me so much discomfort. In the end, I placed it in a drawer, determined to forget about it. But the discomfort didn't go away. As the days went by, strange details began to appear around the house. At first, they were small things, shadows that seemed to move in the corners, or inexplicable sounds in the middle of the night. I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, the result of solitude and stress. However, these incidents became more frequent and harder to ignore. One night, while trying to sleep, I heard clear footsteps in the hallway. I jumped up, thinking someone had broken into the house, but when I checked, I found nothing. Still, the feeling of not being alone was suffocating, as if something was watching me from the shadows. That same week, I decided to seek out Guilherme again. He seemed to be the only person I could share what was happening with. When he arrived, he listened attentively as I described the strange occurrences. Despite his calm demeanor, I could see concern in his eyes. After a few minutes of reflection, he said, "My grandmother always said that pacts leave marks. Maybe this is one of them." His words disturbed me. Had I brought something else into my life by making that pact? Guilherme suggested that I go to Donna Simone again, but the mere thought of confronting her filled me with fear, almost as much as the phenomena I was experiencing. Even so, I knew I couldn't continue living like this. I mustered the courage and returned to Donna Simone's house. When I arrived, she seemed to be waiting for me. "I knew you would come back, Jose. They never leave completely," she said, even before I could speak. I told her everything that had happened since the ritual, Bruno's death, the strange events in my house, and the constant feeling of being pursued. Donna Simone listened in silence and then explained that pacts with forces like this always come with a cost. Sometimes the payment isn't immediate, but it always comes. They found something to take, and now they are connected to you. Those words didn't bring me any comfort, but at least they helped me understand that what I was experiencing wasn't just in my head. Donna Simone offered to perform another ritual, this time to calm those around you, as she described it. But she made it clear that this might not resolve everything, because certain things can't be undone. I went home that night overwhelmed by a sense of resignation. I knew my life would never be the same. Although I had regained my material possessions, I had lost things far more valuable: my family, my peace, and perhaps my very soul. The following days became an endless cycle of restless nights and silent mornings. Sometimes I would think about Isadora and how she would have faced all of this. But now I was alone, facing the consequences of my choices. And no matter how much I tried to push the thought away, I couldn't ignore the feeling that the worst was yet to come. As the days passed, the strange events in the house became more intense. The shadows were no longer just quick glimpses. Now I saw them clearly, figures walking down the halls. At certain moments, a sudden cold would take over the space, even on the hottest days. The most terrifying thing, however, were the whispers. In the dead of night, in complete silence, I would hear voices murmuring my name. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But when objects started moving without explanation, I realized I could no longer deny it. One night, while preparing to sleep, the closet door slowly opened right in front of me. A chill ran down my spine, and frozen in fear, I couldn't move. I stayed still, my heart racing, my eyes wide open. The next morning I called Guilherme again. I couldn't put it off any longer. I told him what had happened, and he listened with a look that mixed concern and sorrow. My grandmother always said that pacts leave marks even after they're made. These forces don't disappear without consequences, and the marks they leave can attract things beyond our control. I asked what I could do, but Guilherme seemed unsure. "I think the best thing is to talk to my grandmother again. Maybe she knows something more that can be done, but I can't guarantee anything." Despite my fear, I knew I had no choice. I couldn't continue living like this. When we arrived at Donna Simone's house, she seemed to already be waiting for us. "I knew you would return, Jose. These forces never leave completely. They always leave something unresolved," she said before I could speak. I explained everything that had happened since my last visit. She listened in silence, and then stated that the forces I had invoked had found their way to me. It wasn't something that could be easily erased. I can try to close the doors that were opened, but I can't promise that everything will disappear. The scars of a pact are permanent. Although it wasn't what I wanted to hear, it was the only option. That night's ritual was even more terrifying than the first. This time, Donna Simone used not only the photo I had given her, but also a piece of my hair and a garment that had belonged to Isadora. She drew a larger, more complex circle on the floor, covered in strange symbols, lit black and red candles, and began chanting in that incomprehensible language I had heard before. The atmosphere in the room changed rapidly. The air grew dense, almost electric. The candles flickered violently, pushed by a wind that seemed to come from nowhere. Donna Simone continued chanting, her voice rising gradually until suddenly she stopped. A deep and overwhelming silence filled the space. She finally looked up and said, "They have agreed to leave for now, but the mark they left on you cannot be removed." I asked what that meant, but she didn't answer. She simply looked at me with a gaze that mixed compassion and resignation. Guilherme took me back home that night, but we didn't speak a word during the journey. I felt completely exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The following days seemed calmer. The shadows and whispers disappeared, at least for a time. However, even with the apparent normalcy, the unease didn't leave me. Donna Simone's words kept echoing in my head. The mark they left on you will not go away. What did that really mean? What more could happen? A few weeks later, Carolina called me. It was the first time one of my children contacted me since the trial. For a moment I thought she was trying to reconnect, but I soon realized that wasn't the case. Her voice was cold, distant. She called only to say that she intended to sell the house where Isadora and I had lived, the place where my children grew up. "It's the best thing for everyone," she said with a firmness that cut like a knife. The news devastated me. That house wasn't just a property, it was the last connection to the family we once were. I tried to argue, beg, but it was in vain. Carolina and Matthias had already made up their minds. I had no voice in this matter. The absence of Bruno, the only one who had always been by my side, was more painful than ever. With time, I accepted that there was nothing left that connected me to them. My children moved on, each in their own way, and left me completely alone. The house I now live in feels more like a cell than a home. Although I regained my material possessions, I lost everything that truly mattered. The routine became suffocating, the strange phenomena had ceased, but the loneliness that filled my days was more oppressive than anything I had ever faced. Every corner of the house seemed to carry a memory of the past. I would walk through the hallways, remembering the laughter, the happy moments that now seemed so distant they could belong to another life. The nights were even worse. During the day I tried to keep busy, but when darkness fell, it was impossible to escape the anguish. Isadora inhabited my dreams. I always saw her on the porch with her cup of coffee looking at the garden, but in these dreams she never spoke to me. She would only stare with an unreadable smile, which brought more unease than comfort. One of those nights I woke up suddenly, my chest tight, and a cold that seemed to freeze the whole room. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but then I heard a sound. It wasn't a whisper or a distant noise, but a dry crack coming from the living room. I gathered the courage to investigate, but I found nothing out of place. Still, the feeling of not being alone was undeniable. The next morning I called Guilherme again, desperate for an explanation that could bring me some relief. His response, however, only deepened my anxiety. My grandmother always said that the marks of a pact never completely disappear. Even if everything seems calm, something always lingers. Those words haunted me. Did that mean I would never truly be free from the consequences of what I had done? The days passed and the signs began to reappear. This time it wasn't just shadows or whispers, it was the sensations that surrounded me. The air felt heavy, as though something invisible was pressing down on it. An inexplicable cold emanated from the walls. On some nights I would wake up with the certainty that someone was standing beside my bed. Every time I turned on the light, I found nothing. But it felt as though an unseen presence had settled in the house, watching me, waiting patiently. One afternoon, while going through old papers in my study, I came across something that froze me in place. The photo I had given to Donna Simone during the ritual. I couldn't understand how it had returned to my house, but there it was, on the table, as if it had been waiting for me all this time. At first I tried to rationalize it, thinking it was just a strange coincidence. But when I looked closer, I noticed something deeply unsettling. The faces of Isadora and my children seemed different. There was something in their expressions I didn't recognize, a mix of sadness and reproach that caused an undeniable discomfort. That same night I decided to burn the photo, believing that doing so would end whatever it was that was tormenting me. I watched the flames consume the paper, waiting to feel some sort of relief. But as it burned, something felt wrong. The air should have warmed, but instead, an intense cold filled the room. A shiver ran down my spine, and for a moment I could have sworn I heard a distant voice, almost a murmur, impossible to understand. The days that followed were nothing short of chaotic. I felt on the edge of collapse, unable to distinguish what was real from what was a product of my mind or something beyond that. Guilherme tried to support me, but even he seemed uneasy about what was happening. "Maybe it's best to leave this house, Mr. Jose. Some places hold the energy of what happened in them." He was right, but I knew I couldn't leave. That house was all I had left. Even though it had turned into a hostile place, it was my only connection to everything I had lost. Then one night something happened that changed everything. I was sitting on the porch, seeking some relief in the stillness, when I saw a figure in the garden. At first, I thought it was Isadora. It looked exactly like I remembered her favorite dress, the coffee cup in her hand. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. Her face changed, her smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of deep pain. I tried to say something, but before I could, the figure vanished. After that night, silence took over. The whispers, the shadows, the inexplicable phenomena, everything stopped. But the emptiness that remained was even heavier. I knew something had changed, but I couldn't quite define what it was. Now looking back, I realized that my actions were driven by desperation. I believed that reclaiming my properties would bring back something of the life I had lost. But I was wrong. My children remain distant, and the bonds we once shared cannot be restored. Bruno, my youngest, is gone, and the doubt that his death was the price I paid torments me every day. The house where I live now stands as a monument to what once was. Every corner is filled with memories that weigh on me like an anchor. Sometimes I smell the coffee that Isadora used to make or hear laughter echoing in the distance. But when I try to cling to those moments, they vanish like smoke. The pact gave me back what I thought was important, but at a cost I could never have foreseen. And though the forces I called upon may no longer manifest, I know their presence remains here, silent but constant. I live with the weight of those choices, knowing they didn't just affect me, but also those I loved most. If there's anything I can leave as a lesson, it's this: don't tamper with things you don't understand. The consequences are always greater than what you think you're willing to pay. Today, I know that true wealth was never in material possessions, but in the people we love. Unfortunately, I only understood this when it was already too late. If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to leave a like. It really makes a difference. Okay, let's continue. I live in the state of Massachusetts, on a property surrounded by trees, with a long and winding driveway connecting to the main road. During the day, while I was cutting a fallen branch near the entrance, something peculiar happened. I noticed a man, or someone dressed as a clown, calmly walking along the road. He stopped right at the start of my driveway, positioning himself in the center, as if deliberately planning every move. Slowly, he turned his head in my direction, though his body remained facing the road. I have to admit, the costume he was wearing was terrifying, straight out of a horror movie. I let out a quiet laugh, almost instinctively, and tried to offer a friendly smile. Based on what we often hear, I imagined he would suddenly approach, trying to scare me, but that didn't happen. Without any urgency, he simply turned his face back to the road and continued walking. I thought about saying something, but deep down, I decided not to get involved more than necessary. Later that night, I finished my routine of closing the shed outside and turning off the lights in the house. Once inside, I started preparing dinner, but something caught my attention. A sound coming from outside. I opened the kitchen window a little more, trying to hear better, but only the wind and the rustling of leaves could be heard. I took a deep breath, closed the window, and went back to what I was doing. What happened next almost paralyzed me with fear. Intense and violent knocks echoed on the same window I had just locked. My body froze in a mix of panic and adrenaline. Trembling and with my heart racing, I grabbed the knife on the counter and, with difficulty, forced myself to look out the window. However, the darkness outside concealed anything that might be there. I knew I had to face my fear. I walked to the glass door in the kitchen, the one that leads to the backyard. Hesitantly, I placed my finger on the light switch. I waited a few seconds, trying to gather courage, and finally turned it on. What the light revealed was worse than anything my mind could have imagined. The same clown was standing outside, as still as before. He tilted his head to the side like a curious dog, watching me from behind that eerie mask. My reaction, I thought I should open the door and confront him, maybe even attack him, but it's always easy to decide after the fact what should have been done. At that moment, I just ran. I bolted up the stairs to my bedroom where I had left my phone and called the police. While I waited, I heard the sound of the pounding growing louder. He was banging on the glass door with both hands, one blow after another, increasingly aggressive. The situation escalated when the man started screaming, a terrifying, unhinged sound, like someone in deep delirium. I felt like there was no way out. Every minute waiting for the police felt like an eternity. Then suddenly the pounding stopped. Outside, a firm and familiar voice rang out. "What do you think you're doing? Get out of here now." I peeked out the window and saw Robert, my neighbor, coming toward me with a rifle in his hands. As soon as I went out to speak with him and thank him, he explained that the clown had fled into the woods. Shortly after, the police arrived, took my description, conducted a quick search of the area that lasted no more than 5 minutes, and left. Robert insisted I spend the night at his house just to be safe. You can't take chances when it comes to your safety and well-being. Now, as I recount this story, all of this happened just 3 days ago. Recently, a mysterious profile appeared on Instagram, spreading unsettling messages and disturbing images of people dressed as clowns. Among the posts, there was a specific threat. They would show up at my school. At first, many thought it was a bad joke, but the authorities decided not to take any chances. The police were called, and to our surprise, even a tactical team was sent to monitor the situation. The time indicated in the posts was around 11 in the morning. When the clock struck 11, the atmosphere grew tense, as if everyone was holding their breath, expecting the worst. My friends and I still believed it was all just a hoax. In fact, I heard someone mention they had seen a clown at the local pool chasing one of my classmates. I just laughed, thinking it was another absurd rumor. Shortly after 11:15, the nervous voice of the vice principal echoed through the intercom system. "We are entering lockdown. Lock all doors and windows immediately." Despite the scare, I stayed calm. We followed the standard procedure, everyone huddled in the corner of the classroom far from the door. We stayed like that for about an hour and a half, in complete silence. When the vice principal finally announced that we could go home, I felt an immense sense of relief. I grabbed my things and started my walk back home. My house is about 1 kilometer away from the school, a 20-minute walk. I put on my headphones and went on my way. Soon I was walking through an area surrounded by trees, which for some reason felt darker and more unsettling that day. About 5 minutes later, I noticed something unusual, a figure in brightly colored clothes. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my imagination, but I looked again, and it was still there. The person was wearing white pants with yellow polka dots, all torn and filthy. A yellow shirt, equally worn out, completed the look. They had a mask with red hair sticking out from the sides. Their head was tilted, and they were staring at me, motionless. Suddenly, they let out a high-pitched, maniacal laugh before sprinting in my direction. My instinct took over. I screamed, dropped my backpack, and ran back to the school. As soon as I arrived, I found a police officer and reported what had happened. He muttered a curse and called for backup. Shortly after, several officers headed to the area I described. I don't know if they managed to catch him, but I like to believe they did. Rumors began circulating that the clown had reached the school's entrance, threatening to come inside. I didn't witness any of that, but it's possible it was the same person. The police conducted an extensive search in the area, but he likely escaped and hid in the woods. That means the clown is still out there, spreading fear and causing more terror, just like so many others. I decided to go camping for the first time with William, my boyfriend, even though I had butterflies in my stomach. I had always heard unsettling stories about La Rumorosa, many of them featured in supernatural account shows. Besides that, when my father was still young, he experienced something so frightening and impactful in that region that he avoided talking about it. Whenever we traveled to Tijuana, he preferred taking the longer route through Ensenada. And when there was no choice but to cross La Rumorosa, The crossing was always rushed and silent. Because of all this, I already felt a sort of fear, almost a reverent respect for that place. Still, William's enthusiasm was so contagious that I ended up giving in. He and his family had many happy memories from there and had never faced anything out of the ordinary. We left Mexicali at dawn, stopped for a leisurely breakfast, and then continued on our way. At a certain point, we left the paved road and took a dirt track. We arrived at the forested area William loved so much at the exact moment the sun began to slip below the horizon. Despite the forecast of snow, we decided to press on. We set up our tent and built a fire to cook a simple meal. The sky, filled with countless stars, was something only La Rumorosa could offer. However, the wind began to howl, and the temperature dropped fast. Soon the snow started falling, snuffing out our fire and forcing us to shelter inside the tent. Night wore on. After some good conversations and laughter, the natural sounds lulled us. But, in the middle of the night, an unsettling silence set in. It was a stillness so thick it made us realize how isolated we were, or at least, that's what we thought. Around midnight, I woke up with my heart pounding. A sharp crack of breaking branches sounded very close by. William noticed my nervousness and stayed alert. The noise not only continued but drew closer, accompanied by a low, guttural sound. Something that seemed to come from a large creature, something the size of a horse, slowly walking around the tent. William tried to calm me, suggesting it might be some animal disoriented by the snow, maybe a deer separated from its herd. He had seen a few around there in the early hours before. He grabbed a flashlight, made a small cut in the tent, and peeked outside. What we saw made our blood run cold. A creature moved around us, large as a horse but twisted in an unnatural way, as though its limbs bent at impossible angles. The sound of bones cracking accompanied each movement. Its head was the most terrifying feature, something between a monkey and a human, but with the skull exposed, no skin from the upper half up, revealing only bone. I held back my scream with all my might. William immediately turned off the flashlight. The creature seemed to be just sniffing around, as if trying to locate us without seeing clearly. It let out a low growl and continued snapping branches as it walked, coming dangerously close. Every second felt eternal until, for some reason, it lost interest and went away. We heard its steps grow more distant until everything dissolved into silence. I have no idea how we managed until dawn, but as soon as the first rays of the sun appeared, we decided to pack up as quickly as possible and leave that forest behind. While we gathered our things, we found deep footprints in the ground mixed with mud and snow and broken trees all around, confirmation that it was no mere nightmare. Years have passed, but that night in La Rumorosa remains vivid in my memory. I never shared this experience with my father. I can't predict how he would react, but I suspect his experience there was completely different, since La Rumorosa holds secrets few can explain. Who knows, maybe one day if I find the courage to ask, and he feels comfortable telling me, I'll share his story with you. Before we get to the last story, if you're still here, let me know what time you're watching in the comments. I love seeing who sticks around until the end. Let's not stop now. On to the next. It was a Friday night. It was already past 1 in the morning when I was heading home after visiting a friend. The route was short, only about 1 kilometer, but enough for the solitude and silence to make me uncomfortable. The air was cold and slightly damp, as if the forest alongside had absorbed all life and left only shadows. I decided to cut through a trail that crosses that area, a choice that seemed practical, but which soon proved to be a mistake. That trail was a well-known shortcut in the neighborhood. During the day, it was not uncommon to see children playing or adults walking their dogs, but at night, everything changed. The trees seemed to form a dense canopy, blocking any light from the stars or the moon. The flashlight on my phone was my only source of light, casting a beam that felt far too small for the vast darkness. Every step seemed to echo more loudly than it should, and I began to regret not having taken the brightly lit streets. That was when I heard the footsteps. At first I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe it was an echo of my own footsteps. But as I stopped to listen, I realized I wasn't alone. There was another rhythm, another presence. Maybe someone else taking the same shortcut. But something about the tempo of those steps felt off. I remembered stories circulating on the internet about masked figures showing up to scare people. Stories I had always considered exaggerated, but which now seemed all too plausible. I turned off my flashlight and hid behind a tree. My heart was beating so fast I feared it might be heard. My chest rose and fell at a frantic pace, but I forced myself to stay quiet. For a moment I wondered if fear was just messing with me. Maybe it was just someone else trying to get home, like me. But then I saw them. Two figures stood still, not too far away. Their costumes were unmistakable even under the faint light. Clowns. The clothes they wore weren't cheerful but bizarre, as though they had been put together from scraps of old dirty costumes. The most disturbing part was that they were completely motionless, like statues. Something about the way they stood there in the middle of the path, without moving or making a sound, froze my blood. They knew I was there. They had probably seen the beam of my flashlight before I turned it off. And now, standing in the middle of the trail, they seemed to be deliberately blocking my way. Fear took over. For a few seconds I was frozen, trying to decide what to do. The air felt heavier, as if the very environment were against me. And then, as if they knew exactly how to unsettle me, they began to move. Their movement was slow, calculated. Each step they took seemed louder than it should have been, echoing along the path like a warning. My urge to scream was smothered by pure survival instinct. The moment I realized they were coming toward me, I didn't wait any longer. I ran. I ran like never before, without looking back. The woods seemed alive, with branches and leaves trying to hold me back, but I didn't stop. When I finally reached the streetlights, my legs nearly gave out. The relief lasted only a moment. Looking back, there was no sign of them, but that didn't comfort me. I ran all the way home, locked the door, closed the curtains, and sat on the floor trying to catch my breath. Not long after, curiosity got the better of me. I had to check. I went to the window and pulled the curtain back slightly. My heart almost stopped. Across the street, standing by the entrance to the forest, they were there, motionless, just like before, staring directly at my house. At that moment, there was no longer any doubt. They were following me. But why? The idea that it might be just a cruel prank was tempting, but something about their behavior told me otherwise. They weren't trying to scare me for fun. It was something else, something I couldn't understand. The night passed slowly. Every small noise seemed like a harbinger of something awful. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me, but my rest was cut short by a sound that chilled my blood. A knock on my bedroom window. It was soft, as if someone were testing my reaction, and then it grew stronger and stronger. I couldn't move. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to pretend I was asleep, but the knocking persisted. When I finally gathered the courage to look, I saw a face. Beneath the small gap between the curtain and the window, there was a tilted face watching me. The clown's grin was wide and grotesque, as if it was enjoying my fear. I don't remember exactly how I reacted. I ran to my mother's room, screaming and crying like a child. She woke up immediately, grabbed the pepper spray she kept by the bed, and went to check. When she raised the blind, he was gone, but what she saw was enough to make me feel I wasn't crazy. Handprints on the glass, drawn in blood. And since that night, the feeling of being watched has never left me. The clowns haven't shown up again, at least not that I know of. But something tells me this isn't over yet. Next time, I'll be ready. I have a camera prepared to capture any movement, but deep down, what terrifies me the most is the thought that maybe they don't need to appear for me to know they're there. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Click the notification bell to stay updated on all future narrations. I post new videos here every day. I hope to see you in the next one. On the screen now, I'm leaving 2 other great videos I know you'll enjoy. See you there.